Thank you. Ellie. Thank you for coming out on such a balmy evening. Each time I come out to introduce our scholar in residence, I try to say a little something different. So for those of you who are here listening to all the talks, you have variety. You might wonder when you look at the programs, how do we actually manage this? I mean, normally on subscriptions, it's the same program all week, and usually 4 rehearsals. And yet here we are in Mozart Festival mode, and there are 2 different programs each week. But there are still only 4 rehearsals, sometimes 5. So how do we do that? We do it, 1, very well, and 2, the orchestra just throws themselves into this. By focusing on one composer, we establish already at the first rehearsals the kind of sound, the style we're going to play this particular composer in, or at least as far as I believe it, and the one that works for the orchestra. But for this festival in particular, something extraordinary is happening. And that's the fact that all of you who listen to the concerts have the opportunity to hear our magnificent musicians, not just as an orchestra, but soloists front and center. Tonight, you will hear 4 of the members of our orchestra, 2 violinists, horn and clarinet, in addition to rather lengthy obbligato solos from cello and oboe in the concertone. The 4 horn concertos are particularly remarkable because each one is being played by a different member of our horn section. There are not many orchestras that have the 4 players who can do that because they're all hard pieces. So I know that there's just a little bit of extra charge in their colleagues who want to support them in the highest way possible by providing the carpet in which their sound can be heard. And I think that energy and the elegance translates really well to all of you. You get to know them in a very different way, and so do I. So it's particularly exciting to have this connection, this more personal and close-up connection with the members of the orchestra, and I hope you all do enjoy it. We do have basically 3 concertos tonight and an overture. There'll be a little surprise at the beginning of the concert. You might be able to figure it out by now, but it's there. Aside from that, tonight you're going to learn about Mozart's life in Vienna and Prague from our scholar in residence, and here is Kathryn Biggin.
What a pleasure to be with you all on Mozart's birthday. This is really wonderful. No place I would rather be. Well, as a young man who had grown up in a provincial cathedral town, Salzburg, Mozart's professional experience and his goals eventually outstripped his surroundings. And he went searching for employment as far away as Paris and Milan. And ultimately, he would choose to settle in Vienna, which was the capital of the Austrian Empire and the seat of the emperor and his court. During the final decade of his life, 1781 through 1791, Mozart would call Vienna home and strive to take advantage of every professional opportunity that it had to offer. The other city that held major significance for Mozart was Prague, the second city of the empire and the capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia. Mozart would travel to Prague several times during this decade and would stay there for weeks at a time when he was involved with producing an opera. And unlike Vienna, which waxed hot and cold in response to Mozart's music, Prague always greeted him with the love and respect of close kin and would claim him as its own. So for this evening's talk, which takes place on Mozart's 261st birthday, I thought it would be fitting to discuss these two environments that were so important to his development and success as a mature composer. Who were the people and what were the institutions in these two cities that were most valuable to him? So Vienna, when Mozart arrived, was a city of some 200,000 persons. About a quarter of them were crowded into the central district within the city walls. There were many palaces, big houses with ground floor shops, many stables, many horses and carriages. The noise must have been terrific. It housed the central bureaucracy of a vast empire, so it was filled with officials, diplomats, soldiers, hangers-on, middle-class entrepreneurs of all kinds. Under the reforms of Emperor Joseph II, many monasteries had been closed, but churches were still plentiful and active. There were new hospitals and schools, a flourishing publishing industry, which was also fairly new, including publishers of music, maps, and prints. Joseph's tastes were simple, and even though he lived in the Hofburg, which is the enormous pile of stone that you see on the left in the slides, his court was rather austere. So the nobility of the city entertained in their own palaces, which were the backdrop for many of the city's concerts and social events. Mozart benefited directly and immediately from these circumstances. One of his very first patrons in Vienna was a noble lady, Countess Wilhelmine von Thun, an accomplished musician who welcomed him in her palace, lent him her fine piano for concerts, and introduced him to other musical members of the aristocracy. Such introductions were crucial to a composer like Mozart, who did not have a formal post, but who wished to build a career in the city. Some of Mozart's first regular concert series took place not in theaters, but in salons of aristocrats and wealthy diplomats and other supporters of fine music. Another important patron and musician was the Baron Gottfried von Swieten, a long-serving member of Vienna's diplomatic corps and director of the Imperial Library. Swieten held weekly concerts at the library for a small circle of musical amateurs and professionals, including Mozart, who would read through ancient music. And it was here that Mozart would develop a thorough acquaintance with the music of Bach and Handel and immediately begin to use their techniques in his music. Later in the 1780s, Swieten and a society of noble gentlemen would hire Mozart to direct an important Handel revival that would bring a number of his great oratorios, including Messiah, for the first time to Viennese audiences, and with Mozart's own additions and changes and his own direction. Vienna supported a lot of good composers, but there were three in particular who were especially important at the time of Mozart's arrival in 1781. First was Christoph Willibald Gluck, composer of the most significant new theatrical music of the 1760s and 70s, ballets and operas. One of the great events of 1781 was a formal visit to the capital by Archduke Paul of Russia and his wife. Among the many celebrations was a revival of Gluck's most important works, which gave Mozart an opportunity to hear a true master of the theater at work. Gluck's music would have an immense impact on Mozart's operas. Gluck's foremost protege, and the composer who took over his leading role as court composer, was Antonio Salieri. Which one is the real Salieri? Unlike the Salieri of Peter Schaffer's play Amadeus, the real Salieri, who is the one on the right, was not a scheming, jealous poisoner of a young rival, but rather a confident and productive composer whose operas were consistently popular at the court theaters over the course of many years. Indeed, an important point about Salieri was that he was exclusively an opera composer, which put him in quite a different realm from Mozart, who made his name in Vienna primarily, at first anyway, as a piano virtuoso and as a composer of instrumental music. So Mozart's true rival, if we can say that, of a composer whom Mozart honored above all others, was Joseph Haydn. It was Haydn who, over the course of long years in private service, produced the huge body of work, sonatas, symphonies, concertos, string quartets, and operas, to which Mozart aspired. As court composer for the princely Esterházy family, Haydn circulated with them between their estates in Austria and Hungary and their big palace in Vienna. Here, during the winter months, Haydn and Mozart came to know one another, to socialize, and even to play quartets together. That is something that I would love to have been a fly on the wall for. One of Mozart's first big projects in Vienna was a cycle of 6 string quartets, which he labored over ardently and then dedicated to Haydn. During his first year in Vienna, as Mozart was breaking ground in so many areas to establish his career, he was also forming deep personal bonds. Among the musical Weber family, whom he had already befriended years before in Mannheim, he now found a wife, Constanze. Much has been said and written about Constanze, and as with the Salieri stories, most of it is unsubstantiated by evidence. She has been accused of frivolousness, selfishness, and various kinds of dishonorable behavior, but the letters that survive from Mozart to her offer an image of warmth and gaiety and good humor. She was a solid musician, judging by the pieces that Mozart wrote for her to sing, and she must have been a woman of intelligence and sympathy. The portrait that you see here was executed by her brother-in-law, an actor and amateur painter named Joseph Lange. And he is also the one who painted perhaps the most famous portrait of Mozart at around the same time. So these two portraits together, painted early in their marriage, around 1782-83, by a family member. Constanze and Mozart had 6 children during their 9-year marriage, but only 2 of them, Karl Thomas and Franz Xaver Wolfgang, survived to adulthood. Over the course of their marriage, they moved from one apartment to another in Vienna, partially for economic reasons. Vienna was an expensive place in which to live. In 1784, they lived in the largest private building in central Vienna, and it's the building that you see on the right of the slide with all of the little statues across the top, a huge multi-purpose building, built by publisher Johann Thomas von Trotner in 1776 and known as the Trotnerhof. Though they lived in a tiny apartment in this building, Mozart was able to rent a small concert hall downstairs for a series of subscription concerts in the spring of 1784, including first performances of 3 of his piano concertos. It was probably for those concerts that he purchased a piano from Vienna's most important keyboard builder, Anton Walter. Once he had the piano, the pace of his concert life picked up considerably, and his father, who visited him in 1785, wrote, "Every day there are concerts, and the whole time is given up to teaching, music, composing. It's impossible for me to describe the rush and bustle." And one of the things that made it seem so busy was that Mozart was moving the piano back and forth from his home to his concert venues, including private homes such as that of the Russian ambassador, Prince Golitsyn, who was a music lover, and also to a place called the Mailgrube, which was a large former granary that at this point housed a casino, a ballroom, and a concert space. And Mozart gave another series of subscription concerts in the Mailgrube. The Mozarts spent the longest period of time, when Mozart was enjoying probably the peak of his success, in a house on Wallnerstraße, quite near St. Stephen's Cathedral at the heart of the town. In recent years, it has been renovated. There is a hotel in the front part of the building, and at the back is the entrance on the Domgasse, and this now serves as a Mozart museum. Many of you may well have visited at some point. It was in this house that Mozart composed Marriage of Figaro, many of his concertos and other works. Its music room would have witnessed rehearsals and concerts with many of his singers, quartet evenings with Haydn and others, and many other social occasions. It's worth noting that Mozart's concerts during this period were his most important source of income, and he was tireless in planning and promoting them. His venues were various, from the small, busy spaces like the Mailgrube and the Trotnerhof, to aristocratic salons, to the two court theaters, one of which was the Burgtheater, the one closest to the court. You see that in the far right, the small building on the far right, the Burgtheater, and the other was the Kärntner Tor Theater, also a court theater with musicians that were in the employ of the imperial court. These were primarily sites for opera, but they also hosted large orchestral concerts, and there were a few occasions when Mozart was able to hire the space and get an orchestra and give some grand benefit concerts for himself. Another consistent income stream for Mozart was teaching, and he had numerous students in Vienna. While he was still living in the Trotnerhof, he taught the wife of its owner, Frau Theresa von Trotner, and he wrote his C minor sonata and fantasy for her, so I suspect she must have been rather good. One student who actually came to live with them in the Schülerstrasse flat was the boy Johann Nepomuk Hummel, whose early training with Mozart would lead to a very prominent career as a pianist and composer. Another important student was a young woman named Barbara Ployer, whom Mozart referred to as Babetta in a rather affectionate way in his letters. She studied piano and also basic composition with him. She must also have been an excellent pianist, judging by the concertos that he wrote for her. And quite a few of her exercises survive, revealing something of Mozart's methods as a teacher, as well as what might be the sole portrait of young Babetta, sketched by Mozart himself. These are just three examples of pupils who came to Mozart from various social classes, some with professional aspirations, and others who simply wanted to improve their skills through working with an extraordinary musician. Now, people often wonder about Mozart's spiritual life. He grew up a devout Catholic, and in the small cathedral town of Salzburg, worship was obviously at the heart of civic activity. This remained true to a certain extent even in the much larger city of Vienna, where its cathedral, St. Stephen's, occupied a prominent geographical and social role at the heart of the city. Mozart never lived far from St. Stephen's. He worshipped there, he was married there, he baptized two of his children there, he played its great organ. In 1791, he was appointed as an adjunct to the aging Kapellmeister at the cathedral and would have succeeded him in the post if he himself had not died in December that year. Mozart's funeral was held in one of St. Stephen's chapels. Complementing his Catholic faith was his membership in a local Masonic lodge, zur Wohltätigkeit, which meant beneficence. He joined them in December 1784. Freemasonry, with its stated objectives of promoting tolerance, freedom of thought, and charity toward others, was an important community for gentlemen of enlightened views. And in Mozart's time, there were 6 lodges and about 200 Freemasons in Vienna. Among its members were numerous musicians, including Joseph Haydn, along with writers, scientists, doctors, and other middle-class professionals, as well as aristocrats. Since music was an important part of their meetings, Mozart contributed songs, cantatas, and a good deal of instrumental music, particularly for winds, for use in his lodge. Now, what would Mozart have encountered when he first arrived in Prague in January 1787? Though the second largest city in the Habsburg realm, Prague's 78,000 inhabitants lived within a fairly small geographical area. Its citizens walked from place to place, and during Mozart's second sojourn, he frequently traversed the town on foot to reach the Villa Bertramka, owned by his friends, the Duscheks. Prague was a city of towers and spires, and though Joseph II had closed many of its churches and monasteries, the university and its great library had expanded and opened to the public. It was a city full of wealthy nobles, but in this period it was not a royal or imperial seat. It was a city with a vigorous concert life, full of fine musicians and people who were quite well educated in music. Most significantly for Mozart, it was a city that since 1724, when Count Spork opened a theater to public audiences in the new town, it had cultivated a sophisticated appreciation of Italian opera. By the time Count Nostitz opened a new theater in the fruit market of the old town in 1783 and appointed Domenico Guardasoni to produce his operas, Prague possessed a more engaged and knowledgeable opera-going public than anywhere else in Central Europe. No wonder, then, that Mozart felt at home there and eagerly accepted the commissions that were offered to him in 1787 and 1791. The first opera to engender a passion for Mozart's music in Prague was Abduction from the Seraglio, which was presented during the inaugural season of Count Nostitz's new theater in spring 1783. Mozart's Czech biographer, Franz Xaver Němeček, wrote about Prague's encounter with this opera and its impact on the city's relationship with this composer. And I'll just read you this little passage. He says, "I was witness to the enthusiasm that its performance in Prague created. It was as though what one had hitherto heard and known was not music at all. Everyone was enchanted, amazed at the novel harmonies and the original, previously unheard of passages for wind instruments. Now the Bohemians began to seek out his works, and in that same year one heard Mozart's keyboard pieces and symphonies at all the best concerts. From then on, the preference of the Bohemians for his works was decided." Now, the powerful affinity for Mozart's music that Němeček describes led to the proposals that finally brought Mozart to Prague in his first visit during the season of 1786-87 that produced Marriage of Figaro. Though Mozart and his wife arrived only in January, the furor over Figaro had begun with its first performances that fall and had not died down. Němeček writes of the public's unprecedented enthusiasm for the music, which quickly appeared in piano arrangements, wind, string, and dance versions, so that soon all of its tunes echoed in the streets and parks, something that Mozart himself commented on. Němeček also relays the excitement that Mozart's music aroused in the musicians who played it, and makes it clear that it was due to direct invitations from the orchestra musicians that Mozart went to Prague. Performances of his instrumental music at this time, particularly a memorable occasion in the packed theater where he played a concerto and improvised at the piano, further established his reputation in Prague. And Němeček actually wrote about a concert where Mozart played a concerto, they heard a symphony, and then he says at the end, Mozart improvised alone on the piano for over half an hour, and our rapture stretched to its highest extent and dissolved in loudly overflowing applause. must have been quite marvelous. Can only imagine. So this visit forged the strong bonds between Mozart and Prague that would secure the commissions for Don Giovanni and La Clemenza di Tito and draw him back to the city for their performances in 1787 and again in 1791. Each of those trips found Mozart deeply engaged in composition, rehearsals, and other composition tasks, and thus lasted at least a month. He also made 2 shorter stops in Prague in 1799 on journeys to Berlin and back. From surviving letters and other accounts, we know a fair amount about where Mozart went during his visits to Prague. It's possible to trace his steps around the city's old town, of course, with the theater at the center of his activities. But then, if we cross the bridge, which is still there today, Mozart actually spent a lot of time in the district called Mála Strana, the Little Quarter, on the opposite bank of the river from the old town. He stayed in a palace with some of Countess Thun's relatives for a time, and later, he also stayed at the Unicorn Inn, which is the same inn where Beethoven would stay during his trip to Prague in 1796, and it is now still there and being run as a luxury condominium. Another thing that Mozart did was have a mass. One of his masses was performed in the great St. Nicholas Church in the square in Mála Strana. He also visited the Strahov Monastery, nestled up amongst its orchards on top of the hill. And that had another terrific organ, which he also played and improvised upon. He had a very close friendship with a soprano named Josefa Dušek, with her and her husband. And they made him a frequent guest at their villa, Bertramka, which is also still there in Prague. And at that time, it was enveloped by a vineyard, by a park, by gardens and orchards, and it would have offered him a serene refuge from the city. And it was there, for example, that he finished up Don Giovanni. It was there that he also worked on Clemenza di Tito. So I hope that this little tale of 2 cities will help shed some light on Mozart's progress as a composer and as an individual in the final decade of his life. His life as a man with a family to support, as a freelance musician in an expensive city, was not easy. But both cities offered vibrant musical institutions within cultures that valued music and supported it. And 261 years later, in this institution, which still values and supports great music, we are more than ever grateful that Mozart's has reached us across the centuries and that we may celebrate it together. Thank you very much.